So I guess from everyone who's in the audience, could you just give me a show of hands of people who have already applied to CIHR, and this might be your second time making an application? Is anyone in that boat? Yeah, a few people. Oh, okay. Okay. Got it. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Okay. Now I feel like a talk show host. So, okay. So then the majority of people are making their first time application to CIHR. Okay, great. So I've kind of structured this based on my experience working with CIHR as a funding agency to granting. And what I wanted to bring to you today was some information about how CIHR has shifted the way in which they look at doctoral research, which has actually changed quite a bit over the last 4 to 5 years as CIHR has restructured their entire funding process. And I think some of the best practices that go into grant writing really need to now be highlighted in doctoral applications. And it's those applications who use similar strategies that successful grant writers are using. They have more success when they go to make their first and hopefully last doctoral application to CIHR. So what I wanted to bring to you today was the idea of responsive research and what responsive research might mean, how you can locate responsive research within your own research program that you put forward to CIHR, and how you might even start to think about extending the idea of responsive research past your doctoral studies into if you go forward for a postdoctoral fellowship, or even if you're thinking about tenure track research. And a lot of the idea of responsive research is centered around a project that I'm working on right now at the university, where we're starting to engage in a collective university level strategy to promote what we're calling engaged research, which means research that really steps outside of just having an impact within the bounds of academia, but has understandable impacts to end users, to industry users, possibly to policymakers. And so right now we're working through what that looks like as an institution. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today is something that we're also working on institutionally. So what is responsive research? We're starting to work through a definition of this, but I think really responsive research, like I said, moves beyond the bounds of academia, and it describes programs of research. And so I think one thing you need to think really strongly about when you're constructing that narrative, which I know only takes one page within the actual application, is programmatically, what is this large question you're trying to get at as a student? And how does the project you're proposing get at starting to answer this much bigger programmatic question that you probably won't answer in the 4 or 5 years you're going to be studying? Right? Because good research, when we put big grants forward, they're programmatic in that they're trying to answer massive questions based on small, distinct projects that have tenable timelines, that have outcomes that we can understand on a smaller scale. But those all intersect into this much larger time frame, much broader, more innovative thinking that the program describes. So the first thing is they're complex. These programs of research are very complex and have many moving parts. They're also probably multi-sectoral. And what I mean by that is that they probably cross the boundaries not only within academia, but also outside of academia. So they may have end users that could be, say, clinicians. It may have end users who are practitioners of some type. You may even start to cross into end users who are pharmaceutical companies or other types of people who manufacture biotechnology or biodevices. So I don't think you have to be limited in thinking that your research only has to exist in one small sphere. And I think if you can put forward in your application across the multiple parts of it, that your thinking goes beyond the one project you're describing, you're going to create a much more holistic, much more innovative proposal that many reviewers at CIHR will recognize as being the hallmark of really, really robust research. And like I said at the beginning, they're responsive to not only issues, problems, and contexts that we have to identify within academia, because none of this really good transformative research can occur if we don't first understand the academic context it lies within. But we also have to understand how it can move beyond that academic context, and what are some of the vehicles to do that. And that's one thing I'll talk about in this presentation as well, are some of the ways in which you can talk about moving your research from academia beyond. So I think it's really important that when you think about writing a grant or writing your application, you really have to be creating a narrative that's demonstrative of something. So a lot of times people will write their application and they'll say, you know, this work is innovative and this is the project and this is what it will do. But you don't demonstrate how What is the mechanism for what's happening to occur? And it's really critical when you're building a narrative about either a grant or an application to do research like you're going to do, that you're really actively demonstrating the impact of the work, so using evidence, and that you're using words that demonstrate how the work will change something or someone or some process. So how does this project interconnect to that bigger idea, and what will it eventually help to change or transmute or start to build forward in these larger ideas? It's also really, really important that what you write is understood across a really diverse audience. So you're going to choose which group your application is going to go to, but then after that you don't have a ton of control over who's going to actually be reviewing the grant. So you absolutely need to write this grant in accessible language. You should not use jargon at all, especially when you're writing in such tight time space constraints, like 1 and 2 pages. Filling it with jargon is going to make it really inaccessible, and you're going to make your reviewer have to work harder to access the information that they want from the application you're writing. So a critical feature, I think, of demonstrating impact is that addition of really sound evidence. So how can you take information from your CV to bolster your claims that you have the skills to do the work you're talking about? Have you had publications that are analogous to the work you want to do? Have you done work in the past that's led you to have certain skills in the lab or in the clinic that make you the perfect person to undertake the project you're proposing? It's really important that you think about the application holistically across all the parts. I think a lot of people, when we first make these applications, it's really daunting, and you sort of get into silos and think, well, I'll just talk about my CV in the CV section, and I'll just talk about the research in the research section, and I'll just talk about my training plan in the training section. But really good applications show crossover between all of those different sections. So it's okay for you to talk about CV accomplishments in your training section as a basis for why you want to push your training forward. A great way to start that would be to say, these are the things I've accomplished, and based on these accomplishments, I want to continue pushing my training forward in whatever way it is that you say in your application. Or like I said, you can use that as evidence that you have the skills to undertake the project or projects you're proposing within the summary of the research section. So the summary of the research is considered one of the most essential pieces of the entire application, and it's a really tricky piece to write because it's just that 1 page. So I would encourage you to take as much time as you can and as many revisions as possible to get that page as clear and coherent as you can. On average, those are read in under 5 minutes by reviewers as they're moving through the stack of reviews they have to make. So you really want that first paragraph to be as crystal clear about what the overall objective is, what you think the outcome will be, and how does that interconnect to whatever this context is you're working in. And that context can be this programmatic idea, this much bigger idea that your small project is trying to get at. So you have to obviously work really closely with your supervisor on this, and I would encourage you to do that, to try and get time with your supervisor to talk through your ideas, and contextually how does this work fit in with their larger program of research is also a really good idea to highlight. And you really do need to make a case for the fact that a lot of this thinking is yours, so that you weren't just handed this project by your supervisor, but that you creatively and innovatively worked with your supervisor to come up with these ideas. And you may have honed the ideas with your supervisor, because we don't expect that you're going to do everything on your own. But CIHR is definitely looking for those graduate students who have thought through ideas on their own and brought either partners or ideas or research concepts to their supervisor that may be a little bit different than what the supervisor was doing. So as my slide says here, the overview is really, really important. Like I said, that first opening paragraph is critical in any grant or research application. It's one of the most critical pieces. When I review grants, if by the end of the first page I can't step away and say why it's innovative, what the context is, and what you're going to be bringing to the table that's new and different, I can tell you that that grant is going to have a much harder time getting funded. That first page is considered the make or break, and you literally have 1 page. So it's really, really critical you have all that information in the right place. And like I said, the summary should reflect the significance. So how do we show significance? How do we demonstrate significance? We do that through research impact. So something is considered to be more significant if it's going to have more of an impact. And so where can we find these impacts? Well, we can find them as they relate back to the original context. So how is this linked to the context? Is it going to add to the context and make it more robust? Or have you found a hole in that context that you're going to come into a whole new area of thinking to sort of augment what was thought to be the norm? Other ways you can think about significance are translation out of academia. So you don't have to limit your thinking only to impacts within research, but we can start to now, and CIHR is demanding now, that we start to think about impacts outside of academia. So will this be passed off at some point to a clinician? Will this be passed off to a company? Will this be passed off to academics in a totally other avenue who will take up this initial research and then maybe bring it to an animal model if you're working at a cellular level? These are all translations of research, and they all have to be highlighted in this one page. So again, I think if you do that, it leads us back to that original proposition that this is really responsive research because it's complex, it's multi-sectoral, and it's responsive both to academia and beyond. So how many people are aware of CIHR's guidelines and definitions of knowledge translation and integrated knowledge translation? Okay. One, okay. So I would really highly suggest that you all Google CIHR's definitions on KT and IKT. This is the bedrock of what CIHR does. CIHR has a responsibility to the federal government to report back health outcomes that are directly related to funding at CIHR. If you do that in your application, you have made your reviewer's job so much easier because you've given them a roadmap to say, absolutely, I can see outcomes beyond academia from the work proposed. And they don't have to be huge. Nobody thinks you're going to solve or cure a disease or that you're going to come up with the next artificial implement that will change something. At the graduate level, if you even have the understanding that your work can contribute to these outside academic outputs, you're already ahead of the game because a lot of people, like I said, stay in a silo and just think subject matter based, project based. So it is important to familiarize yourself with the difference between the idea of KT and IKT. So KT is really, for CIHR, considered translation at the end of a project. So you're done your project, maybe you're in year 4 of your PhD, and now this step will happen that you're going to maybe write up some lay work around what you've done, and you're going to translate maybe to a body of practitioners, to a set of clinicians, to policymakers. And I would really caution you that if you're going to say that, you do a little research to show that you actually understand who you're giving it to. Because a lot of people's applications fall short when they say, and this work will contribute to changing evidence-based policy. But they don't show any understanding of how policy actually works. And so one note for you, right, policy for the health world is dictated at the provincial level. If you really want to make strong impacts in health policy, that happens provincially, not generally federally. On the other hand, if you're talking to a body of clinicians, those are generally held at the federal level and they make different disciplinary regulations across Canada. So just if you think you're going to hand off to one group or another, make sure that you've done a little bit of research to say that you understand where this is going to go. Because often people make these claims that it will, generate policy outcomes, but they fall flat because there's no real sense that the person understood exactly what that statement meant. So if you're going to make those statements about translation, back up that you understand where it's going to go. So quite in contrast to the idea of end of project, KT is the idea of integrated knowledge translation, which literally is what it sounds. The translation starts from the beginning of the project and moves throughout the course of the project. And those outputs from integrated KT should look and be addressed within any of the milestones that are happening in the work. Generally, integrated KT happens when there's cross-sectoral integration in the research question itself. So you may have a clinician who's come to a basic researcher to say, we need to solve for X in this patient population. You're the person at the cellular level, for instance, who can help us look at what we need to know to make better diagnostic outcomes here. That would be considered ITK because the two multi-sectoral groups have come together to frame the research, and then they're going to move through together to make sure it's translated at all of the appropriate steps. So that's a difference to know, and it is a nuanced difference, but if you show you know that nuanced difference in your application, again, it's another way you're going to set yourself apart from people who would just sort of throw the word around and say they think they're translating when it's really not clear that they understand where or how. Are there any questions about that? If you have questions at any time, just stop me. Whoops, there we go. Okay, so how can we then evidence that the responsive research will occur? Because it's one thing to think we'll do it, but how can we evidence that it will occur? One thing I would suggest that you also look at is this article that came out in 1991 and has been really fundamental in structuring CIHR's understanding about knowledge translation, especially knowledge translation with vulnerable populations. So if any of you are working with populations that are considered to be vulnerable, this is a really great bedrock article that sort of set up the really massive change that happened within CIHR and then trickled through NSERC and SSHRC as well. And Kirkness and Barnhart came up with this idea that for research to truly be responsive, it had to be relevant, it had to be respectful, it had to be reciprocal, and it had to be responsible. So if in your research you are working with a population that is considered vulnerable, I think framing that the research question came through a dialogue based on these 4 principles would be a really fantastic way to show that you really understood what it meant to do this translation work with people who need to have their agency heard within the research. Because CIHR is very, very cognizant of the fact we can no longer do research on people, we should do research for, by, and with people. And when you Google CIHR's IKT and KT sections, there's a lot of great writing through the Institute for Aboriginal People's Health about this shift to by, for, and with rather than on. And this is sort of the bedrock of that. And obviously the way we engage in this kind of research is through actively listening to our partners. And that might take time. So that's one really critical thing when I'm reading applications where people say they're doing this type of IKT. If you don't show that these conversations have happened over a number of months, I'm less likely to believe you're really embedded and doing IKT, because you have to build trust with your partner if you're really, really going to answer these deeply held questions. So timeframes are really important to put in any type of application, especially when we're talking about this kind of work. You may be a researcher, though, for whom this doesn't really matter because IKT and embedded research is not something that you're going to do, and that's completely fine. Not everybody does this type of work. So what I would suggest, though, is that you have a conversation with your supervisor about, well, if you're a CIHR researcher, what's your IKT plan or KT plan? Because every single person who holds a CIHR grant writes a KT plan. And so by asking your supervisor about what their KT plan is might give you a really good idea about how to frame the work you're doing. I think another good question to ask them would be, do you have an idea of what my role as your grad student is in that KT plan? Because if you do, then you have a great section of your training section written for you. You also have a way of representing that you understand that KT is something that has to go across all of the sections of your application. And I think then again, like we talked about earlier, you need to think beyond the application. So who will use the research and how will the research contribute both within and outside of academia? Because CIHR is going to be reticent to fund something that only contributes within academia or only contributes outside. There has to be an even split sometimes, or at least a recognized differential between where the biggest impacts are going to happen. But like I said, really good knowledge translation rarely occurs without really significant impacts happening within the academy as well. They go hand in hand. So why is demonstrating impact through responsive research essential to your training? And that's one of your sections, right? And basically the answer is because CIHR determined recently in the last 2 years that the future trainees that they see as leading the way in Canadian health research are, one, going to be leaders of tomorrow, who can lead high-impact multidisciplinary research in a rapidly evolving environment of advancing technologies and globalization. So that's key too. If your work goes outside the bounds of Canada, highlight that. So I think that would go back to our first slide. That's the complexity that we were talking about. This goes across disciplines, it's multifaceted, it has a lot of moving parts, and it's rarely just subject-based. The leaders of tomorrow are also go across knowledge sectors, like we talked about. It's multi-sectoral. So how does this work apply, and how can you apply your scholarship and talent to lead innovations across different sectors of Canada's knowledge-based economy? And the third part is your experts in critical priority areas. So CIHR always has priority areas, and they make priority area calls. Familiarize yourself with CIHR's website. Go and look at the language that surrounds these priority areas. If your work intersects with those priority areas, use the language that's free to you on their website that describes what they think is innovative about, for instance, data management. That's one of them right now. If you're doing big data work, big data medical sets, this is something that CIHR is really, really excited to fund right now. If you would do work with Indigenous people, that's another priority area right now. Go to these different institutes of health that they have set up. Use the language that's available to you. Because if you write in a way that CIHR understands, you're going to have a much better chance at convincing that reviewer that your application is that much better than the one that's literally like 0.25 away from you in that ranking order. And so the other idea too is that CIHR wants to see a well enough rounded student that you may not end up in academia. You may end up going into industry. You may go into clinical practice. You may go into something else that CIHR has never thought about. But they're reticent to really fund anymore people who just get a very, very select skill set within one discipline and are far more apt to fund people who can show they get an array of skills. So in that training section, if you can show back to, again, the research problem, if the research problem was multi-sectoral, if the research problem was multi-partnered, if it was complex, you can absolutely show that you are getting a breadth of skills that you're not getting if you're just subject disciplinary specific. So another key section, you get 2,000 characters, which isn't a lot, but it's really, really critical, I think, that you think through this section with your supervisor. And that's the demonstration that you know your research environment. Now, why is that important? It's important for a few reasons. It's important because it sets the stage that institutionally we are the very best place for you to conduct this research. If after 2,000 characters you can convince the person who reviewed your application that Western was the best place with the best supervisor and the best other analogous supervisors to do the work you're carrying out, then you will score very, very highly in this section. So that leads to context again. What is the context of Western specifically, both in infrastructure and resources? And by resources, we're talking about people generally. Infrastructure is going to be equipment. So is there key equipment here that you have access to that you absolutely need to be able to carry the research forward into this new innovative path? Resources can be other supervisors, other people maybe who work in an institute on campus, the ability to have cross connections with clinicians. We have an excellent hospital network. Are you taking advantage of that hospital network? Do you know how that hospital network impacts your own supervisor's work? Because most supervisors will at some point have intersections with the hospital networks in London. Does your supervisor do they have connections to the advanced medical manufacturing that's now happening in London? There's been a proliferation of advanced medical manufacturing that's happening here through our research park and through the new research park that was just set up. Many people who do biomedical work actually have a huge vested interest in that and are really liaising well with industrial partners there. So these are types of ways you can think about translating your knowledge out and gaining really interesting skills back. And I think that was all I had to say formally, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer anything that anyone has. And I think Paula will make the slides available, so you can have them. Good luck.
Yeah, it's a big hand for Erin. Thank you so
no problem.
So I'm going to come around. Anybody have any questions? This is a prime time to ask because as you start into your application. Don't be shy. Camera's off, I think. Is it off? Yeah.
So we chatted earlier on about the reviewers for CIHRs from all different sectors. So how do we position ourselves so that it's how we appear on the application is good across sectors?
That's a good question. So I think first and foremost, you have to be true to the research paradigm you're coming from. So you don't want to be so diluted that people can't locate you within a discipline. But that being said, you still have to be able to show how you can think outside of that discipline as well. So I think it's meeting sort of a sweet spot that if somebody reviewed it, they would know, oh, you're a biochemist or you are an immunologist or whatever the baseline department would be that you're working in. At the same time, like I said, do you, though, as a grad student, understand these interconnections between places to show that you have this breadth of thinking? And like I said at the beginning, the way you do that most effectively through the narrative is that it has to be really accessible. So that's where you have to cut the jargon out of the application and really use plain language, because we can't guarantee who's actually going to read this and understand it. So you have to have the hallmarks of good science there, but you have to do it in a way that's completely accessible to somebody who may not actually be in the field of study directly that you're working in. Okay, the thing you want the person to come away with from that summary is to really understand the innovation that lies within your work, regardless of who they are.
So you said earlier that in your summary you could include parts of your CV to kind of show your skill set. So could you sort of elaborate on that a little more? How, like, just because we are restricted on words.
Yep. So for instance, I mean, a great example would be if you were working in an area where you had published papers, you could cite yourself. Right? That would be fantastic, to cite your own work to support what you're claiming. Most people aren't in that position, but some lucky people are. Other ways you could do it is if you were talking about extending a set of experiments that maybe were related to something you'd published before, you could work in a few words to say that based on my past publications in this area, I feel like the skills I gained from doing XYZ experiment lend me to be the perfect candidate to be able to carry out the work I've addressed here in these ways, and then list them. Show how you understand the connection between the skills you gained in that first work that led to the publication, and then the skills that you're going to take into these new experiments. Because a lot of this is really a game of how do I carry forward skills I gained before and show it as being evidence for what I'm saying I'm going to do now. And so really the thinking is mapping out where do the connections happen between what I did 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and how do they impact what I'm proposing today. Does that make sense? Yeah, and I mean, if you had citations in some of your papers, which some people might, put in your citations. I mean, even though they may be small at this point, it still shows that your work is having an impact, right? I mean, don't diminish the fact that maybe you have 5 or 10 or 15 citations, which, you know, competing against your supervisor, that's not going to matter. Competing against your peers to have cited work is a way to really, really set yourself apart. So, you know, if you have 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 citations, just note that this work led to 15 independent peer-reviewed citations. And based on that work, I'm really clear in understanding the direction I'm going to take my skills and in the way I'm going to take this research forward. And you can also do that in the training section, right? So if you want to talk about publishing more, you can talk about your past publication record as the basis for going forward to publish more, or in maybe different journals, right? If you want to show the breadth of your research, which is one thing CIHR is interested in, you can talk about how, you know, you may have decided that you've published in one area because that's where your MSc was, but you now want to open up into a whole new area, and you can say, based on my experience publishing here, I now know what I need to do to go forward, and these are the types of skills I want to gain in this training program, and my supervisor supports it through, you know, whatever modality.
Yeah. So, with regards to innovation, I know CIHR is a very traditional sort of organization as well. And mine works actually in new IKT models. Okay. And I challenge those traditional models of publishing, peer-reviewed journals, blogging, Twitter.
Yeah, so non-traditional publishing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which to me is very important.
It is.
And so I would like to talk about those things. Some people who say, no, CIHR doesn't care about those things. They just want to know about the peer-reviewed publications.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
So that's a really good question, and it brings up a really big issue of things that are currently somewhat irreconcilable at CIHR. So there's this push for all of this work that you're talking about, but at the same time, they still really want you anchored in traditional research. So I feel for you. It's a difficult spot to be in. So I guess my best advice to you would be to play both sides of that coin. Have a section where you talk about the peer-reviewed standard work that is in journals that people understand. But then, is there a way that you can cleverly have a section, maybe in the training section, where you talk about the real value and importance to building partnerships, building connections? Can you talk about the amount of time you've worked with your partners and how these blogs have been influential and instrumental in maintaining that research? That maybe, you know, I mean, I've talked with a lot of people, and even in my own work, if I didn't have the connections I do with my research community, I wouldn't be able to come back to them with another project, right? So if you can show continuation of work and that building of trust through these other modes, I think that you'll begin to build a case. And I think what's really important to remember, and this is sort of how I try to think about it right now, because we don't have a good metric for this non-traditional work. And I think all of them fail short. I mean, you can use something called Qualtrics, which will track Facebook posts and blogs and things like that. But if you then give that to a really pure scientist, they'll say, well, that doesn't count. I don't care about that. Like, what's your H index, right? So I think what you have to do is you have to make the case qualitatively for the non-traditional work. So tell a story about it. Where's the agency in the story and how you utilize that work to push your research agenda forward? And then you use the quantitative metrics to support the traditional research. So this many citations, the journal had an impact factor of 3.7, all of the traditional things people want to see lined up for you. And I would caution against doing one or the other, but do a blend of both. And even I'm thinking, you know, in your summary of the research, you could even have one or two really clearly articulated sentences that talk about the value of this non-traditional work as a means of creating this knowledge translation. Right? So the basis for your knowledge translation plan is all of this non-traditional work you're doing, whereas the validation of the work within academia happens through this other route. So in many ways, you have a bidirectional approach to knowledge translation and impact, and you need to capture it that way. Does that help? Okay, great.
Just a reminder, if you haven't gone to our funding opportunities page to look at the internal process, we're closing the CIHR Doctoral Research Awards competition early this year, and it will be closing early going forward. So the application submission date for Western, if you haven't entered ResearchNet yet to see that, is September 4th. And it's exactly 1 month before the national federal deadline of October 4th. The reason we're doing that is to help you. We're convening a new university centralized review committee. So there will be some engagement and back and forth during that time period while applications are being reviewed and possibly returned for revision and corrections. Okay? So it will close early, but there's great benefit to that. So
Yeah,
I
and
just wanted to make you aware of that.
If I can put a plug, the more eyes that read this for you, especially not within your discipline, the better, because you'll just get that broad review. And I think the questions you want to ask, even if you're handing them off to other grad student peers, is do you understand what I'm doing? A, what is my research question? Where's the context that this research lies, and where's the innovation? And if your friend can't tell you the answers to those questions that align with what you thought, you know places where you need to do a bit of work to make sure that it's really, really clear and coherent, and that the argument is sound. Because when a reviewer will read this, things that reviewers hate the most are reading messy applications that don't make sense, because it actually angers them. I mean, they have hundreds of these to read through, and to waste their time on one where they think like, come on, just tell me what you're doing, you don't want to be in that position. So the more reviews you can do, the better.
Any other questions? There's no such thing as a silly question.
There isn't.
And I guarantee that whatever question you're thinking about, somebody else wants to ask it too.
Oh, Nicole.
We were talking about to follow up on a question about how to use the CV to into the application. Like you were talking about publication, but would it be worthwhile to put emphasis also on extracurricular activities that someone has like to show up leadership?
This is a great point. Absolutely. So anything else that you've done in your career to date, like Nicole just said, that can verify through evidence that you have leadership skills is fantastic in that CV section. Absolutely. Yes. And anything else you've done that may be sort of really outside the box, but you see a connection to the work you're doing, put that in there. You can talk about it. I mean, when CIHR is looking for this really well-rounded, diverse person, they're thinking of somebody who has a very diverse background that's cut across a lot of different experiences. So how can we put into narrative what those experiences mean and how they help you to be a better, bolder, more innovative thinker using, the terminology that CIHR is really interested in looking for. I think gone are the days that CIHR says, oh, you have a 97% average, here is your doctoral research award, right? That's the way it used to be. You just had to be an excellent student, a decent writer, and you would get this. That is not the competition you're in today, and it's not the competition grant writers are in today, because 6 years ago, you had a great publication record, you went to a lot of conferences, you had good grant history, here's your next renewal. But that's not the way it is. I mean, we're seeing attrition of some of our best researchers in Canada no longer being able to get their foundation or project-based money. So the way that this is shifting across all levels of the Tri-Council, not just at the graduate student level. And so if you can hone these skills early, if you decide to go onto a tenure track position, you're going to be that much further ahead when you actually have to contemplate writing your first grant, because you've sort of gotten into that very complex systems thinking early about how all these pieces fit together and come together. The other thing I should mention too, if you've gone to lots of conferences, so if in your MA, if your supervisor was awesome and supported you to go to lots of conferences, mention those. Those are also peer reviewed to a certain degree, right? You're getting feedback. If you got really interesting feedback at a conference and you can incorporate that into your new application, that's a fantastic thing to mention as well.
So if the deadline's in September, if you have things upcoming, including publications you've
Yep.
submitted, not heard back from, things like that, would you include that?
Absolutely, yeah. So those would go under in publication, that would come under, so if it's submitted and it's going to be published, that would come under forthcoming. If you've submitted something and you don't have an R&R back, you have no response, you would just put it under submitted. So the hierarchy would be in press. So in press is just waiting to come out. So fully published, in press, forthcoming, and then submitted. And I think it's a great thing to show if you have things in the pipeline, that's another thing you want to talk about, right? So you're not just the student who's now waiting for your supervisor to say, oh, hi, can you edit this and I'll let you put your name on this. But if you really have a lot of things coming up that are interdependent of what you're actually proposing, but aligned, then that again shows you have the skills and the leadership skills to be able to push this program and project forward to what we hope will be the completion of a really, really fantastic PhD contribution, and that will set you up for other things. The same with conferences. If you have conferences you're going to attend but haven't yet, put those there and just put the date beside it to, that I will attend it at XY time. Yeah. Obviously, if you've won awards, please mention those and write about them too. Don't just have them in the CV. When I talk to reviewers, they do their best to really scrutinize the CV, but sometimes awards are missed. And especially if you got an award, I don't know, from the Kiwanis Association or the Rotary or something that was sort of non-academic, but was because of work that you had done that maybe made you a great leader. Mention that somewhere in the application so that you highlight that, well, this was actually in my CV and this was an award and it's really important because it connects in this way. Obviously, if you've won other big academic prizes, I would re-mention them. I wouldn't just leave stuff like that in the CV module, just because if you're reading 100 applications, they get lost in the mix. So highlight your accomplishments.
Any other questions? Okay, I just want to mention that the registration link is not up yet, but you will notice on the Strategic Support Program page that there is going to be a writing lecture given by Paul Schmidt aimed at health and medical sciences scholarship applicants. And I can tell you right now that the firmed up date is August 8th in our classroom. The time escapes me, but you can check on the website. And we'll do a general mail out too, and you'll also hear about this from the grad program. Okay, so big hand to Erin for this.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks for coming.